Hey there, everyone. Thank you for listening to this episode of Lorecast. I just wanted to come in before the episode and say thank you to this episode's special guest, Oran from Podcast Evolved, a Halo-centered podcast. In this episode, we get to talk about the Flood and a little short story from Halo Evolutions, part Midnight in the Heart of Midlothian. So I hope you all sit back, relax, and get to meet a new fantastic guest. And I hope that you all enjoy this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Today, we're going to be talking about more Halo lore like we did in the last episode. I had a special guest last episode, and this episode there's a special guest too. I have Oran from Podcast Evolved, one of my favorite podcasts, Halo podcast.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I found your podcast when I was thinking about starting my own. It was I found Robots Radio, and then was looking into lore because that's one of my favorite things. So then I typed in Halo lore, and I got into Mission Debrief. That's how I found you guys, really.
Oh, okay. Yeah, our kind of mission by mission series.
Yeah, because there's a little lore sprinkled in along the way. That's how you guys frame it, and that's what I liked about it a lot.
Right on. Well, yeah, that's one of our actually more popular shows, and Colin kind of streamlines that, and yeah, it's been a huge success. So we're very.
So you had the suggestion of you wanted to do the Flood lore, because I suppose it's not. It's to me it is more niche, I would say, especially because when it gets to the precursor type stuff.
Yeah, I think the Flood's a very overarching topic, because if you played the games, you're familiar with the Flood, or at least the original trilogy. They're an enemy and they're a faction in there. They have their own kind of collective mind. They pose their threat to the galaxy and all that kind of stuff, and they're pretty easy to get into from that point of view. But the Flood as a whole have just a huge sort of backstory with it as well, with, like you said, the precursors and the Forerunner Flood War, and kind of why Halo is Halo. Kind of the history of those installations are solely because of the Flood. So there's a lot more in there that you can kind of dive into, and so I figured that'd be a very easy topic for people who kind of want more deeper Halo lore that already have something to go as a reference point if they're familiar with the franchise.
Yeah, I like that. That's because it is so central to the lore of Halo. I think it's a fantastic. I'd say if you want to jump into Halo, that'd probably be a good starting point, I would say, for me anyway. That's how I sort of started to get into the lore, because I read the books, and you mentioned one short story from Halo Evolutions, the little book, and that's
Yes.
one of the only books I have read. I'm only halfway through it, but I've been reading it since high school, though. That's the problem. So I've had it for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's great is that a lot of these stories, there's over 30 novels at this point, and even if you've never read one before, or you're just coming into it, the stories are pretty timeless, and they do take place in more or less the history of Halo, and there's less, I guess, in the more modern era of Halo, where we are today with Halo Infinite and Halo 5. But yeah, there's just so many good stories out there. So if anyone's just starting out, or if you're still making your way through the short stories, the short stories are actually in and of themselves good places to start, because they branch over many different timelines. There's many different characters. You talk to different factions. Like, you might have a human story, and then a Covenant story, then a Forerunner story, and so you do get a good mix of kind of everything in the Evolution short stories, and then Fractures is another one that came out.
Nice. Isn't so the main precursor Flood that I know of is the Primordial. The Primordial, and he was in some of the terminals in Halo 3. That was before I really appreciated the lore when I was a kid, because I started pretty much with Halo 3. I had played Halo 2 when I was a kid, but then when I became middle school age, that's when Halo 3 was super popular. So I started playing that over and over again. And I never looked, I just found the terminals every once in a while, and then I never really read them because I was a kid. But now going through them as an adult, I'm like, wow, there was a lot of deep stuff in here that you can just glance by and not even realize that there's a deeper second story going on.
Right, and even when I started playing it when I was in high school, and those terminals kind of went over my head a little bit because they were a little dense, kind of talking about Mennonite bias and the librarian and
Yeah.
who these forerunners are, and then who these precursors are. It does get a little complicated, and the Forerunner trilogy, those novels written by Greg Bear, they give huge insight that are their own conversation, kind of into what the Forerunners were prior to the rings and all that kind of stuff. But even those books leave a lot up to
Mm.
interpretation and kind of allusions to what how you think it may have occurred, or just the fact that we don't know really that much about the precursors,
Mm.
and so we just kind of have to infer a little bit and kind of go from what the Forerunners tell us.
I like how you mentioned the Forerunner trilogy because ashamedly I did in your book club that you have on the channel on your podcast. You talk about, hey, you should probably read these before coming on and listening to the whole thing. But I listened to the books through you guys, so
Well,
that's a big point that you guys always talk about. Is you always talk about the books to read are the Forerunner trilogy and the Kilo 5 trilogy. I think you call them
Kilo 5.
Kilo 5. Yeah.
Our panel of hosts, we really are drawn to those two trilogies. There is kind of obviously the original trilogy where you have the Master Chief and
Mm.
Fall of Reach, and that's more or less classic, no joke
Yeah,
Halo.
those are the ones I have.
That's the essence, so to speak.
Mm.
But removed from that, though, those two trilogies are just great stories within their timeline, and the three books really flesh out the overarching story that they're telling. And then all the other books that are kind of scattered across the lore timeline, they're not as cohesive, I'd say, as a trilogy is for those books. But yeah, the Forerunners, like I said, they give you, it's really the prehistory of Halo, and there's no real other medium that goes into that depth. We have the terminals from CE anniversary and Halo 2 anniversary, and like you said, Halo 3 and even Halo 4 have some pretty Forerunner based history in there. But those novels are really, if you want that prehistory Halo, what came before the UNSC and humanity as we know it today, and all that kind of stuff, then that's like a good place to start. And then for Kilo 5, it's a great sort of like post Halo 3 story.
Mm.
And so it really tells, okay, now that we saved humanity, the flood are supposedly gone, the covenant's completely broken, how does the UNSC now move on? How do what are the um, intergalactic relations between the
Yeah.
Sangheili and within the covenant there are factions that still want to believe in the covenant or
Mm.
believe in their own thing, and so there's a lot of different ideals that goes on in those books that kind of open up this post-war era.
I'll absolutely have to read those books. I'm actually really glad that because when we were emailing back and forth, you said, hey, we should do the flood because in the last episode, I had Chronicler 177, Machinima artist, and he said, I asked him at the very end, I was like, hey, what's your favorite bit of lore? And he's talking about the Star Roads, which I didn't know what those were. And I asked, oh, what is that? And he's like, they're these massive things that the precursors had that lay dormant across all, they connect solar systems and planets together. And then I started looking into it. And then when the Forerunner Flood War happened, the Flood used them. So I think it's really interesting that it's in that late dormant, but it's connected to the Flood and the precursors, is that the Flood could use these Star Roads because they were sort of the remnants of the precursors.
Yeah, they're again very kind of complex, just in terms of how our our human brains kind of wrap around it. But yeah, they're basically intergalactic like highways that information and thoughts can kind of go around and
Mm.
traverse. And yeah, the flood utilized that kind of against the well, not really the precursors, but more so the forerunners.
Mm.
And 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 yeah, there's a lot of interesting kind of those types of tidbits.
I suppose we should probably go into the lore because we still haven't yet. But so the Flood are introduced in the first game. That's like the first introduction we ever had to the Flood. It's in the very first game, and it's presented as a parasite that needs to be contained when we see 343 Guilty Spark. He's like, this is a massive outbreak, and so as on a surface level, it just looks like they're a gross parasite, and you get a little bit introduced into what grave mines are when you had the was it proto grave mine with Captain Keyes, but I don't think you think they had that in mind in the first game was a proto grave mine, because it looked
I
like
think
for
so.
me, yeah.
I mean, I think Bungie had their kind of seeds that they were planting, because I mean, when you look at Halo 2, you have a full-fledged
Mm,
conversation with a grave mind, and kind of start really getting into what the flood knows and what the great journey is, and they have that really great scene
mm,
after I think it's the mission Regret, where you have Master Chief, the
yeah,
Arbiter, the Prophet of Regret, and the Monitor for Installation 05.
yeah,
And they all have their own different point of view, but it's all really about the same
the same
thing.
thing.
That when you fire the Halo rings, it destroys all sentient life,
Mm,
and one faction wants it for another reason, or doesn't want it for a different reason. But to kind of get back to it, yeah, essentially the flood came during the Forerunner sort of height of their ruling of the galaxy. They held what was called the mantle of responsibility, and that essentially says that they are the stewards of the galaxy. They're there to kind of shepherd civilizations and other beings around the galaxy, and help develop them to achieve whatever sort of technological status, and that's meant to kind of be passed on from civilization and species throughout time. But the foreigners were kind of greedy about it and wanted to just keep it, and felt that they were very superior, and felt like they were the only ones who needed to be in charge of it, because they saw all other species as less developed. And even though they assisted, quote unquote, with maybe some dominance, they didn't want those other civilizations to rise to power. So when the flood kind of came into being, it was a threat. Just kind of like your typical zombie invasion, depicted in media. You want to
mm,
study it, you want to see what the cause is, what the behaviors are, and all that kind of stuff. And so part of the installation rings that were created, they did have these like underground facilities where they
mm.
would house and study and and experiment on the flood, just to learn their behaviors. And once it kind of got out of hand, they just sealed it all off. Like, we got to just let it be and walk away, sort of a
Yeah.
thing.
I think it's interesting because it is a little bit different than regular zombies portrayed in other media, because it's parasitic in that it transforms you, but also it's a hive mind effect, because all of the collected knowledge goes to the central grave mind, and every flood now knows everything has ever happened that they've ever touched. And that's the most interesting bit to me. That's how they can pilot craft, and you see them flying ships around. You're like, you think it'd just be some gross little thing flying around, but then it's piloting ships and firing guns, and it's because it's collected the knowledge of everything it's ever touched. And I like that. That's the most interesting bit to me, I think.
Yeah, and that's one of the key, I think, factors of the flood, is that they're all based off of the nervous system, and like the sentience of it is. Yeah. So if you and I were to be consumed, then all
Mm,
the knowledge that you and I have, well, now becomes collected for the grave mind and the rest of the flood to know. And that's why all organic and kind of living matter in that realm is kind of what the flood feeds out to. They just want more and more knowledge to consume. They're kind of like an AI in that sense, and that's how they become kind of so powerful. And as different organisms just kind of grow and grow, and get more like grotesque and
mm,
parasitic, that then turns into proto grave mines, and blanking on the name, but kind of the more elite grave mines in that sort of sense. And that's kind of why I think Captain Keyes was kind of targeted, because he was a very powerful, or he knew a lot of knowledge, from just like what we knew as an NSC captain,
mm.
and and in the position that he was in on a Covenant ship. The grave mine and the flood really wanted him, that to be kind of a center and a very strategic position to have a presence.
Yeah. I started looking as I'm on Halo or Halopedia. There's a lot of different kinds. A lot of them are in the games. You just have your regular infection forms. Sometimes you see spores. I mean, they're part of the background, really, for the spores. Then you have infection forms. Then you have your pure forms. Those are those big hulking things that transform in Halo 3. Those things always freak me out. Yeah. And then the carrier forms, when I was a kid, I called those the broccoli ones.
Yeah,
Yeah, and then you
or
have
the popcorn, the
yeah.
kind of popcorn makers.
But there's a ton more, but I'm guessing those are mostly locked away to the books for now. Or maybe there was a different one in Halo Wars 2. I never really played that one. I haven't played that one.
In Halo Wars 2, there was the DLC called Awakening the Nightmare, and they reintroduced the Flood in kind of the present Halo timeline. And there was a kind of new Flood that was what's it called, introduced, and that was called the Juggernaut.
Yeah.
And so they're just kind of these big, like huge, almost like, if you know, War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
Kind of those alien, like or I guess it's 2 legs and just long arms, and they just have this giant bulbous body just really high up in the air, and they kind of hulk over and move very slowly. And you actually also get to fight them in the arcade cabinet game Fireteam Raven.
Oh yeah, I need to go play that. I live like right on the road from Dave and Buster. I need to go.
It's a lot of fun.
I'll go in there with $50 one day and just see what happens.
Yeah. I mean, it's a prepare you got to spend between 30 and maybe 20 to $30 if you want to go through the whole thing. Just because it kind of it's designed to not be perfect.
Yeah, to take your money.
So then you can keep feeding the machine. So, but yeah, what you said were kind of the generic forms that we get throughout the games. They all have their own different manifestations, and then the key mines are the ones that are kind of the overall arcing collective consciousness that patrol all the other floods in that area that they're in.
Yeah, I'm seeing that. You got like the Juggernaut, then the Abomination is a low-level key mine, and then the Proto Grave Mine and Grave Mine. So there's 4 of them here.
The Abomination actually might be...
That's one that's got like spores on its back. It's full of like yellow pus-looking stuff. It's gross.
I'd have to look it up, but yeah, but in any sense, yeah, as each game kind of comes out and develops, they just like any other type of franchise, they try to introduce different infantry and types of models and stuff for different types of play styles. And for Halo Wars 2 specifically, it's a top-down strategy game, so the kind of flood forms that we're used to fighting against has all been kind of in the first-person shooter perspective. But to kind of give it a different flavor, to give it a different threat, they created different flood forms to kind of do that. There's also flood forms that kind of fly.
Yeah, that was
kind of be that.
Yeah, the first Halo Wars.
Yeah, be that anti-air type of unit.
I also thought that was weird how it was in Halo Wars. I was like, how did they not get the word out? But then I was like, oh, they're millions of light years away, and then they got put in cryo. So that's before Reach and everything happened.
Yeah, the Spirit of Fire.
Write that in, yeah.
Yeah, Spirit of Fire kind of gets rid of their slip space drive to destroy.
Yeah, that was a good one. I like that game.
World.
I played that game too many times.
Oh, they're a blast. I mean, and strategy games are not for everybody, but the way I forget the company name, but
Ensemble before they got bought by
Ensemble Studios,
Microsoft.
They the way they kind of just really put the Halo flavor in it. They made a really effective and kind of true to the series game that made it very engaging and easy to get into. Yeah,
I like that a lot. I wish there was like a horror series. Everyone keeps saying there needs to be a Flood horror series for HBO, and I absolutely would love that. I really would. That'd be amazing. Or like an ODST horror story. Ooh, ODST horror story. Get on to HBO.
Yeah, I mean that's been kind of fanfared around a little bit, just kind of an ODST kind of boots on the ground type of a story. Because with Master Chief you have the armor, you have a certain level of invincibility, but the stakes are just so much higher with ODSTs, and since it's more of your kind of elite military operatives.
So do you think they're going to bring back the Flood for Halo Infinite?
I think they could. I think it would be very not easy, but they can work it in, that it can come that the flood can come back. Part of that is they reintroduced it in Halo Wars 2, so
Mm,
there still it is a flood presence in the galaxy, despite what we did in Halo 3.
mm,
But also from, again, the Forerunner trilogy, to kind of go back to them,
mm,
Installation 07, where Infinite's gonna be primarily taking place, has just a lot of history, from those books, and in there they talk about what they call what the we follow ancient humanity in those books. So we follow humans, but they're not, the humans that
yeah.
we know. So those characters, they hear about this place called the Palace of Pain, which is what they hear as just this kind of torture facility, and it's where all of these flood, sort of experimentation kind of, occurred, and all that kind of stuff. And that's, I want to say, that's where the primordial was for a little while before
Mm,
it was moved away to a time walk. My point is that, that might be a similar facility like in Halo CE at Installation 04, to where we can then discover it again and kind of open up Pandora's box and reintroduce the flood threat. Like I said, not necessarily easy, but it is within the realm of the story to
mm,
introduce them. I think it would be fun to fight them again, but I'm also really open to the kind of the new enemies, and kind of the new threats. There's
yeah.
heavily rumored with like the Banished coming, if you're familiar with Halo Wars 2 still.
Yeah, I know about
Uh,
them. I need to play the game for real and
right.
actually sit down and beat it.
And then whatever Cortana comes up with, she's going to have her
Mm,
AI, sort of arsenal with her. So,
yeah.
um, I would welcome the flood in, but
Mm.
I don't need the flood to come back.
Yeah. Speaking of Cortana, that reminds me of a big fan theory, and that's because people always think, shallow lore people, who do the surface level lore say, oh, the flood only attacks biomass, humans, but they have the logic plague where, isn't that what it was? The spore can like infect computers and AI. So people think that she's not actually going rampant. She's just got the logic plague from talking to the Gravemind in Halo 2 for however long she was talking to him for.
Right, and that's still a theory that's been present since pretty much Halo 3.
Mm,
Because in Halo 3, when we were fighting on Earth and kind of getting those weird sort of flashes and memories of Cortana, and the Gravemind speaking to us, it's kind of the early kind of footprints of that. And there's also a great short story, I think it's in Evolutions as well, called, is it Human Weakness? It might
it
be
might be.
it might be that, but it tells the point of view of Cortana talking with, the Gravemind, and you
Mm,
get a sense of what this logic plague is. And like we said earlier, the flood is just a wealth of knowledge, just like an AI.
mm,
As they continue to consume information, as they um, collect more and more, sentient beings. So they like, AIs just kind of continue to think, and over time, eventually, artificial intelligence just kind of cracks. So yeah, that still could be something that resurfaces. If we really looked into what, Cortana's been through since her
mm,
time with the Gravemind, with all of her rampancy in Halo 4, and then kind of between Halo 4 and Halo 5, she enters the domain and finds the Warden Eternal, and then we kind of get this strange new purposed Cortana with the mantle in Halo 5.
mm.
So yeah, she could have this sort of full consumption to where she isn't fighting with the logic plague, but rather like maybe embracing it.
Mm.
So that could be a fan theory, or just a general theory that could resurface in Infinite.
And I like how you said, it's like when it cracks. And we also mentioned earlier, we kind of glossed over, but mendicant bias. He's another thing that you could talk about for forever. But he get into like a logic battle with a Gravemind, and then he sort of turned. He got turned, and then that's when like he was part of the Flood Forerunner War. Is the Forerunners made mendicant bias to study and like talk with the Gravemind, and then he switches sides, and then so
Right.
it's so interesting to me that something that people think is, oh, it just attacks biological biomass, into it literally turned one of the smartest computers against its own creators.
Exactly. And then with all that, the Forerunners had to, they kind of had like an oh crap moment.
Yeah, they had.
And
What are we gonna do?
And then they then created a new AI called offensive bias,
I
and
remember that.
offensive bias is his whole job is to just combat mendicant bias, and yeah, that's just another sort of example of the flood's power.
I guess we could talk about midnight in the heart of midnight in the heart of the Midlothian. I need to
Yeah,
heart of the Midlothian. There we go.
Midnight in the heart of the Midlothian. So this isn't a flood centric story, but I wanted to just kind of talk about it just because it's one of my favorite short stories in the whole Halo canon. It's very isolated, and I don't want to say too much because I do encourage listeners to go and read it. Or there actually is a motion comic available on YouTube. It's about 20 or so minutes long, and it basically recaps the same story in a visual medium. And but essentially, you follow this ODST who finds out that he has a type of cancer, and so he goes into surgery. And while he's in surgery, Covenant forces attack the ship, and so he wakes up, and just everyone is just gone. He's the only human left on the ship, and the flag, the Covenant just kind of left him because they assumed he was already dead or something.
Yeah.
And so it's a great story as you follow this ODST and the AI that's on the ship, kind of talk about what's going on in the ship and the internal struggles and how he's kind of battling with this cancer. And this is still fairly early in the in the Human Covenant War, and so there's still uncertainties about the species that make up the Covenant, and the Spartans have always been highly effective against the Covenant, but ODSTs, despite their best efforts, they eventually kind of get gunned down and depicted in the medium. So to see this ODST, this lone ODST kind of go up against these guys is really it's a really powerful story.
It really is. I read it back in high school, and then I started watching the motion comic today to get refreshed on it. I was like, oh man, this is such a good story. And now after watching Halo, the anime ones, oh man, I just mentioned it last time too. The
is it Prototype?
Yeah, Prototype. It takes over the same planet, I think.
Yeah,
in Algolis. That's a really interesting connection to me. I was like, whoa, this happened like right above.
If you want the the full story of these events, then you should go watch the anime Prototype and kind of follow that story, because the battle that takes place there, I think it basically ends with some crafts meeting the ship, because the ship is named Heart of the Midlothian, and they meet that ship, and then this short story then takes place.
Oh yeah, Halo Legends. There it is.
Or Halo Legends is the kind of anthology.
It's on Netflix right now.
Oh, is it still on Netflix? Oh,
last I checked, which was a couple months ago, but I have it on DVD.
It was added a couple years ago, so
yeah.
If it's still on there, then good on them.
Congratulations for keeping something up.
But we're right. So yeah, if I think that's animation story is probably 10 to 20 minutes as well. So I mean, it'd be
40 minutes out of your day, get an interesting tidbit there of extra lore you didn't know you needed.
Exactly. And what's great about these stories is that they're self-contained, and so they don't have huge implications of what you would consider the mainline Halo, but what's nice about these stories is that they really flesh out just the world. They do that world building, and that when you say the Human Covenant War, like, yeah, it's a war on all fronts. It's across the galaxy, all the different planets that are inner colonies and outer colonies, and those that are occupied by the United Earth government, and those who are kind of the insurrectionists who oppose that. Everyone's fair game, and they all have the different fronts that they're fighting. And so these short stories are great. Like a lot of the ODST ones, I'm just really fond of. Those are kind of my favorites.
Me too.
Another one called Dirt, and it just follows a squad of ODSTs as they kind of evacuate some civilians that are being under attack, and like it's just really, really good, like Bands of Brother type of a story.
Yeah, they're always family. It's like a family orientated. Like they are a group of guys who sit down and eat together. They do all their training together. They drop pods together, and I love that. That's also one of my favorites on Halo Legends. They have an ODST centered story. about the sniper. I love that one.
A lot of good stories out there.
That
Definitely a lot of consumed. So if
mm,
anyone, yeah,
absolutely.
if
If
anyone's
you,
interested, you just go
I'm glad
ahead.
we started talking about Legends because that gives me a little jumping off point. But of if you really want to see a lot of the backstory that where I learned a lot from the flood was actually from Halo Legends. The first two episodes are takes place when Chief is up in cryosleep at the end of Halo 3. Cortana's just sat there with nothing to do, so she starts monologuing to Chief about the history of humans and what the Covenant War was about, and then how they come together to fight this one common enemy, the Flood. It's also they draw it really gross. I love how the art depicts the Flood in Halo Legends. It's really nasty looking.
I don't recall that one, unfortunately.
That's the first two on the DVD, or if on Netflix, it's the first two. It's Cortana.
Called Origins, maybe.
Yeah, Origins 1 and 2.
Yeah, I
So it's
think
just
so.
Cortana monologuing to Chief about the history of humans, and it even shows like the reseeding of the planets after the Forerunners wiped out all of humanity. Spoilers for Halo. Spoilers. They couldn't find a way to. I guess it's part of the lore of the flood. Um, I guess you have to find out which book it is, so no spoilers for whichever book it is or whatever it is. But they, the Forerunners didn't know what to do. They couldn't like beat the flood because they tried.
Yeah, it essentially just got out of hand and got overrun.
They're like, all right, well, we'll just kill their food supply. And yeah, there we go. That's another thing to talk about. Because people,
Right.
in Halo
So
1, they're like, this weapon will wipe out the flood. It's a weapon that'll wipe out the flood. And then Cortana's like, whoa, Chief, hold on.
yeah, pump the brakes, and she explains it pretty much like you said, surface level,
Hmm.
to where after when you run off to go to the library and you leave Cortana in the control room, she goes through the history of, she goes through her own digital library, so to
Mm.
speak, of what the Halo is, and just gets all this knowledge, and learns that, yeah, the flood got out of hand and the foreigners created the Halo installations to kill all of the sentient life in the galaxy. So then the flood can no longer consume anything. So then they just basically starve
Mm.
of hunger, and it's a pretty grim sort of finale, but
Yeah.
it really is the final stand, that foreigners kind of had. But luckily, with the foreigner technology, they had a lot of kind of contingency
Mm.
plans. Like that's what the library is. When you go to the library, the librarian put forth what she called the conservation method,
Mm.
where she cataloged and inventoried and stored all of the DNA of all the species within the galaxy and put them on the rings. And so then once the rings get fired, and when they do get fired in kind of the prehistory 100,000 years ago, then her job now is to reseed the galaxy. So that's why we have kind of ancient humanity and then modern humanity,
Mm.
because after the Halos do get fired, all life is wiped out, and so the Foreigners now, since they're now limited, because some of them perished,
Mm.
she and her team now go and reseed the galaxy with what they find from the library. And there's also constructs like, Dyson spheres and shield
Mm.
worlds. They're kind of protective installations that are resistant against the energy blast that the Halos put out.
Mm.
So, some Forerunners went there, and like you have Onyx, which is like its own it's like its own solar system within it. Like, it's just this massive structure that can even go into its own slip space. So there's
Mm.
some very complicated and strange things that they created here, but it was all in the last stand effort to, like, well, we need somewhere to hide if the foreigner or if the flood get out of hand.
Yeah, and I like how I mean, it's there's no deep lore within the multiplayer maps of Halo, but there are a few. Like in Halo 2, you had what Lockout, and then Halo 3 had that one where there's like the giant flood pure forms in a tank. For me, that's also just nice, just looking around these facilities, and then someone was like, "Hey, you know how we have the flood? Let's make a level out of it," and it's really interesting to me.
Oh yeah, it's yeah, the way that 343 and Bungie
Mm.
kind of implemented some lore into the multiplayer maps, because yeah, not all of them are like maybe actual destinations. I
Yeah.
think maybe at the as 343 shepherded in the
Mm.
franchise, where kind of every single thing is canon.
Yeah.
They kind of have like there's the harvest map where it just takes place at harvest, and it's kind of one of the few visualizations that we as the gamers have of what harvest actually looked
Mm.
like, minus what we see in like Halo Wars 1.
Mm.
And so yeah, they're the cold storage map from Halo CE that then gets remade, I think in Halo 3, I think the one you were talking about.
Yeah.
But we also have Lockout. There's Isolation in Halo 3, where it's
Oh
kind of like
yeah, and it gets floodier as time goes on. That's a really weird fact I
yeah, and
liked.
like down below it's like overgrown, and then up top it's still kind of pretty and
Yeah.
greenery. So it's yeah, a lot of good ways to kind of show this storytelling of what how the flood kind of takes over and consumes everything
Mm.
beyond just the campaign levels.
Yeah. And I always do want to know, like, I watched how was it, Hidden Xperia. He talks about the lore of, or no, Halo Canon. It was one of those two. Talks about the lore of every map. And I was like, I really wish that there was some guy at 343 or Bungie back in the day who would just sit down and write down like actual lore and find like really interesting terminals to find throughout the level. That'd be too much though, I think. But it'd be fun. It'd be interesting. We got 10 minutes left before you have the main podcast that you're on.
Yeah, so we're going to be recording another short story actually, where we finished all of our novels, or not. Yeah, we've come up to date of all of the novels
Mm.
that have been released since 2001.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
And
that's been a while.
and so part of, like I think you mentioned, yeah, we have our book club series,
Mm.
and every month we go through a different medium. And so lately we've been going through all the novels to kind of catch up on
Mm.
those, but we also dabble in the comics and the short stories. And so we're doing Sama the Painter later this afternoon,
Mm.
which is a short story that I think actually takes place in Covenant, or not Covenant, Forerunner time period.
Nice.
So it's a little topical. But what's good about those is that they're very quick, easy reads,
Mm.
and you can kind of talk about them in like 30-minute spurts. And you kind of alluded to this for when we talked about the Forerunner trilogy that we
Mm.
did. Ideally we encourage everybody to go out and read the books
You
and kind of
should. Yeah,
enjoy it
you
for
should read them
themselves.
first.
And
Otherwise,
then
you're
if
going to be lost like me. Like, whoa, what's going on? Kilo 5, who's that?
But once you do that, then yeah, if you want someone to talk with about it, and you may not have someone, that's where we kind of
Mm.
help part of the discussion. Like even I'll read a book that maybe I missed um, for the podcast, and I'll just listen to my other co-hosts talk about it, just
Mm.
because I want to know their opinions and stuff. But also specifically like the Forerunner trilogy, if it is a kind of a more difficult book to read compared
Mm.
to some of the other Halo novels. And so if you're not one to spend the 10 hours reading the book for whatever
Yeah.
reason, then you could get the broad strokes by just listening to kind of what we say. We
Mm.
try to make sure we don't go too long with our episodes, so they are kind of uh, bullet point talking points, and kind of highlighting the key moments and things that really stood
Mm.
out to us just as fans. And so if you wanted kind of that, then yeah, and our podcast and some of the other podcasts out there as well that are Halo centric,
Mm.
they also have their own forms of book clubs. And it kind of talks about all the extended media, because there is just so much out there.
Since you have something to do, we can wrap this episode up. Is there anything?
Yeah.
Go ahead and shout out your all your credentials. Where can people find you?
So yeah, my name is Oran. I'm part of Podcast Evolved, which is just our growing Halo show. We have actually technically 4 kind of shows within that sort of brand. So we have our kind of main show that just kind of talks about the news and just kind of general lore. So right now we're doing kind of a what we're calling the Road to Infinite, where we just talk about topics that we think are going to be relative and important for Halo Infinite.
Mm.
Nick kind of mentioned that we have our mission debrief series, where we talk about every campaign mission from all of the games. And I think we just started Halo Wars 2, and that's our last game before, and we kind of plan that so then it leads right into Halo Infinite, because there's a lot of missions in Halo Wars 2. And then we've mentioned our book clubs, where we specifically talk about the different mediums, the books, the comics, the short stories. We've talked about some of the TV series like Forward Unto Dawn and like the Fall of Reach animated series. And then we also have a toy show where we talk about the minifigures and the construction sets, and that one's called Build with Blocks. So you can find all of those episodes on our website, halopodcastevolve.com. We also have just our regular podcast feed that has everything on it. And that's just Podcast Evolved on iTunes and Spotify. And it's on a whole bunch of places. Ian's been plugging it everywhere, so I'm sure whatever podcast service you use, it's on there.
That's why I found it was Spotify.
Yeah, so we're really thankful we're to be on all those platforms. So yeah, audio form. We also have a YouTube channel if you want to watch the YouTube versions of them. So they have fancy. We've kind of interspliced some of the what's called the terminals in there, or like for the toy review one, like especially that show, that one benefits it a lot. They're talking about the minifigures of the characters or the construction sets. They're able to, Tom and Colin and them are able to really show you what they're talking about, as opposed to kind of us just talking about the story.
I started getting them because I saw it pop up on my feed on my YouTube subscriptions, and I was like, oh wow, sweet. I saw them in Walmart, so I started buying a bunch of them. I have like 7 now.
So, they're addicting if you get into them.
They are, because they're not that expensive. Well, for each little minifigure, I was like, compared to Legos, which are extremely expensive for some reason. Yeah, but absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come on this little podcast.
No, thanks for being a listener and happy to talk Halo. I mean, that's that's really all it is.
Yeah,
it's a good way to connect and enjoy all the stories that they have to tell.
Absolutely. I'll leave a link down to your Discord in the description, and then I'll leave one to mine as well. So all right, that's going to be all for this episode of Lorecast. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next episode of Lorecast. Thank you again so much for listening. I wanted to come in after and say thank you again to Oran so much for coming on to this episode of Lorecast. I hope you all learned something new. That little ditty at the beginning and the end is a song by Adhesive Wombat. It's called Nightshade, and the song in the middle is Feel That Jank, also by Adhesive Wombat. Thank you all so much for listening and watching if you're on YouTube, and I hope you all stick around and listen to the next episode. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'll see you then.